Well, it certainly is good to see each one tonight. We've had a rather eventful evening with the storm that blew through right at church time here. So made it sort of difficult for some people to be able to make it out. And then, as we mentioned earlier, we do have a good number of our folks that are away traveling this week. And so we certainly do miss them. But we are grateful for the presence of each one as we're starting a study, as continuing a study in the book of Jeremiah. And we are in lesson 20 this evening, looking at some of the things that Jeremiah is going to be discussing or is going to be recorded by him, dealing with chapters 38 and 39 of the book of Jeremiah. I wanted to go back and catch just a little bit of what was involved in the ending of lesson 19, because it kind of ties all of this together. And so I want to look a little bit at the questions at the end of lesson 19 as we kind of scoot into the study then for tonight. Looking at the last four questions or so in the previous lesson, it's talking here about what's happening as we're getting to the very destruction of Jerusalem and the closing down of things, shall we say. Because the Babylonians had been besieging Jerusalem, and then they got wind that there was an Egyptian army coming up to deal with them. And so, wanting to meet them on their terms, the Babylonians temporarily abandoned the siege of Jerusalem to go deal with the Egyptians. But as Jeremiah had told them, don't think that they're going to be gone for very long. They are going to be coming back, and this city is going to be destroyed. And so many people then began to leave the city. The Babylonians weren't out there at the moment, and so they thought they could get away. And so in question 11 it says, what was Jeremiah accused of as he got to the city gate? And what was he really doing? Well, he was accused by the individual who was there kind of, shall we say, guarding the gate in the 37th chapter and going down to about verse 13. It says, and when he was in the gate of Benjamin, the captain of the ward was there, whose name was Arijah, and the son of Shelemiah, the son of, and it goes on with all these names. And he took Jeremiah the prophet, saying, thou art fallest away to the Chaldeans. In other words, what we know is really going to happen here is that you're getting ready to defect. And you're going to go over to the Babylonians and tell them everything about us. And we cannot have that. Now, in reality, the question asks, what was he really doing? Well, if you remember back in the 32nd chapter, God had told him to buy a field back home and to prepare and make preparations for the day in which they would be able to come back from their captivity. And so that was the goal that Jeremiah had. He simply was headed home. He answers this guy back in verse 14. It is false. I fall not away to the Chaldeans. But he hearkened not to him. So Arijah took Jeremiah and brought him to the princes. And the princes were wroth with Jeremiah and smote him and put him in prison in the house of Jonathan the scribe, for they had made that the prison. So Jeremiah isn't allowed to get away. They imprison him thinking that he is going to be some kind of defector. Well, we find here that as we go into question 12, it says, what happened to Jeremiah and what was his message to Zedekiah? Well, you know, they put him in prison, but he had a message for the king in verses 16 and 17. When Jeremiah was entered into the dungeon and into the captain and into the cabins, and Jeremiah had remained there many days, then Zedekiah the king sent and took him out, and the king asked him secretly in his house and said, is there any word from the Lord? And Jeremiah said, there is. For, said he, thou shalt be delivered into the hand of the king of Babylon. So the point that he tells him is that, well, yeah, the Lord's still saying what he's been saying. Jerusalem's going to fall, and you're going to be delivered into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians. And he kind of chides um, Zedekiah here just a little bit and says in the next question, what question and what challenge did Jeremiah present to Zedekiah? And in verses 18 and 19, it says, Moreover, Jeremiah said to King Zedekiah, What have I offended against thee, or against thy servants, or against this people, that you put me in prison? What's the problem here? What have I done? Where are now your prophets, which prophesied unto you, saying, The king of Babylon shall not come against you, nor against this land? So Jeremiah kind of turns the tables on him here and says, where are those prophets now? Historically, if you go back and look throughout the Old Testament, God had said that if prophets made prophecies that did not come to pass, they were obviously not the prophets of God. And Jeremiah has been saying all the way along, the Babylonians are coming, the Babylonians are coming, but those false prophets were saying, no, they're not, they're not going to come, they're not going to come against this land. And they were the ones found to be the liars and the false prophets. And so he goes on and tells him here that this is going to be, your end. That the king of Babylon shall come against you. And verse 20, Therefore hear now, I pray thee, O my lord the king, let my supplication, I pray thee, be accepted before thee, that thou cause me not to return to the house of Jonathan the scribe, lest I die there. So the request that he makes in question 14, was to please move me to a different prison arrangement, because I'm not going to survive long if I am kept in the prison that the princes have put together there in the house of Jonathan. Something is going to happen to me. And so Zedekiah allows that to take place. In verse 21, Then Zedekiah the king commanded that they should commit Jeremiah into the court of the prison, and that they should give him daily a piece of bread out of the baker's street, until all the bread in the city was spent. Thus Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. So Jeremiah gets relocated. He's still trapped in Jerusalem. And soon the Babylonians do return, but now he is trapped inside the city. Well, that takes us then to lesson 20, as we start looking at what happens with the actual fall of Jerusalem. All the way along, what has Jeremiah been telling Zedekiah and the princes of the people about how they should properly react to the Babylonian invasion? Surrender. He said, if you will surrender, then you won't go, your lives will be spared, and the city will not be burned. But if you persist in armed resistance against the Babylonians, many people are going to die, and the city is going to be burned. And so this is consistently the message that Jeremiah is preaching to the people. And so the princes are not real happy with Jeremiah's continued preaching that they need to surrender. And so there's a whole bunch of them listed here in chapter 38 and verse 1, these various princes. And they heard the words that Jeremiah had spoken unto all the people, saying, Thus saith the Lord, He that remaineth in this city shall die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence. But he that goeth forth to the Chaldeans shall live, for he shall have his life for a prey, and shall live. Thus saith the Lord, This city shall surely be given into the hand of the king of the Babylonian army, which shall take it. Therefore the princes said unto the king, We beseech thee, let this man, what? Be put to death. Question 1 is, what was the reaction of the princes of Judah to Jeremiah's admonition? Well, they considered this message of surrender to be treasonous. And they did not want a prophet of God encouraging something different than what they had decided was supposed to be done. And so we beseech thee, let this man be put to death, For thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war that remain in this city, and the hands of all the people, in speaking such words unto them. For this man seeketh not the welfare of the people, but the hurt. So the princes want him to be killed. And in question 2, what is Zedekiah's reaction to this, and what does it show? He doesn't have any nerve.
He came into them immediately and said, do what you want to do.
That's right. What we find him saying here, I can't do anything. It's all in your hand. He says in verse 5, behold, he is in your hand, for the king is not he that can do anything against you. In other words, all of the leadership amongst the children of Israel here in Jerusalem, all the decision-making and the power had been grabbed by these princes. And so Zedekiah realizes, I can't do anything about it. So do to Jeremiah whatever you want to do. Well, they come up with a rather wicked scheme as to how they are going to watch Jeremiah, shall we say, slowly die. By looking here in verse 6, they took Jeremiah and cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah, the son of Hamelech. And there was in the court of the prison, and they let down Jeremiah with cords, and in the dungeon there was no water but mire. So Jeremiah sunk in the mire. What they're actually doing here, if we go down and also look at verse 9, it says, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they've done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they have cast into the dungeon. And he is like to die for hunger in the place that he is, for there is no more bread in the city. They put him in what amounts to a cistern in the dungeon that was filled with muck and mire. It was almost like a quicksand, if you will. And he's going to perish in this arrangement. This is a cistern in a prison dungeon. It's partially filled with mire, and beyond that, they said, don't give him any food. So Jeremiah is going to waste away here in this dungeon, in this cistern, and he is going to die.
It was interesting to me down in verse 12 or 13. It said, take 30 men with you to get him out.
Yeah.
So it was either he was really stuck or he was really moved.
It was really a ways down there to the bottom of this cistern. That's right. It's really an interesting story that evolves here in the next couple of verses. Because an Ethiopian eunuch, normally when we talk about the term the Ethiopian eunuch, we think of the book of Acts. And we think about the official for Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, and Philip talking to him out of the book of Isaiah, and we talk about his conversion. Well, we look here and we find Ebed-Melech is an Ethiopian eunuch that is the one who is responsible for saving the life of Jeremiah. Looking here and continuing in verse 7, it says, now when Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, one of the eunuchs which was in the king's house, heard that they had put Jeremiah in the dungeon, the king then sitting in the gate of Benjamin, Ebed-Melech went forth out of the king's house and spake to the king, saying, my lord the king, these men have done evil in all that they have done to Jeremiah the prophet, whom they cast into the dungeon. And he is like to die for hunger in the place where he is, for there is no more bread in the city. Then the king commanded Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian, saying, take them from thence 30 men with thee, and take up Jeremiah the prophet out of the dungeon before he die. So Ebed-Melech took the men with him, and they went into the house of the king under the treasury, and took thence old cast clouts and old rotten rags, and let them down by cords into the dungeon to Jeremiah. And Ebed-Melech the Ethiopian said unto Jeremiah, put now these old cast clouts and rotten rags under thine armholes, under the cords. And Jeremiah did so. And so they drew up Jeremiah with cords, and took him up out of the dungeon, and Jeremiah remained in the court of the prison. So we see this man having the courage to get involved. You know, everybody else, it was not the popular thing to be on Jeremiah's side. But this Ethiopian eunuch got involved. And he went and begged the king to have mercy on Jeremiah and gave him an update as to where they put him and made the point that if you don't do something, Jeremiah is going to die. And so Zedekiah leaves it up to Zedekiah leaves it up to Ebed-Melech to go and to get him out of the predicament that he is in. And so, as Dwayne mentioned a moment ago, the king gave him 30 men. Right? He was in quite a pit to get him out of, and then also there may have been the idea of needing a bit of a bodyguard if this was discovered. That there may have been some who wanted to intervene and to continue to cause trouble for Jeremiah and his rescuers, and they might be less prone to do that if there was a pretty sizable contingent of men that are there. We don't know exactly why it took so many, but it definitely underscores the urgency of the situation.
It's easy, to me, we should look at this and say, he was just one person that had the courage to stand up. And sometimes we say, well, I'm just one person, I can't do anything. Well, it saved Jeremiah's life.
That's it. You know, in looking at who he was, for question 4, he was an Ethiopian eunuch who served in the king's house, and he was the one responsible for saving Jeremiah. And then in question 5, what did Jeremiah think of Zedekiah's character based upon his past experiences with the king? He didn't trust him. This man could not be trusted. He simply would say whatever needed to be said. And so he knew that just because he'd gotten out of the pit, that didn't mean things were going to be any better for him. Going down to verse 14. Then Zedekiah the king sent and took Jeremiah the prophet unto him into the third entry that is in the house of the Lord. And the king said unto Jeremiah, I will ask thee a thing, and hide nothing from me. Okay, Zedekiah is wanting yet another audience with Jeremiah and wanting to get some final words of encouragement. To me, when I read over this, it's a little bit more like what King Saul did whenever God had departed from him, and now he was facing the Philistines, and he didn't know what to do. He went to the witch at Endor and had them summon up Samuel, hoping that somehow Samuel was going to say, oh, it's all going to be okay, and here's going to be a happy ending to this story. And Samuel said, no, tomorrow you're going to join me, you're going to be dead. And told him that God had departed from him and he couldn't do anything about it. Well, Zedekiah is wanting to know, what has God said? How is this really going to come down? Hide nothing from me. And then Jeremiah said to Zedekiah, if I declare unto thee, wilt thou not surely put me to death? And if I give thee counsel, wilt thou not hearken unto me? He said, I can't trust you. If I tell you exactly what God has said, you're going to get angry and kill me, or you're not going to certainly advocate for me in any way. You're not going to listen to what I have to say to you. And so he just did not trust him at all. But notice in verse 16, so Zedekiah the king swears secretly unto Jeremiah, saying, as the Lord liveth, that made us this soul, I will not put thee to death, neither will I give thee into the hand of these men that seek thy life. So he's saying, I promise you, I will not harm you. I will continue to be your protector, and I will try my best to look out for you. And so in question 6, it said, what was Jeremiah's word to Zedekiah, and what was the basis of Zedekiah's fear? Well, Jeremiah, just kind of paraphrasing, says that if you surrender, you will live and Jerusalem will not be burned. But Zedekiah was more afraid of men than he was in his fear of God. And let's notice what he says here as Jeremiah explains things to him in verse 17. Then said Jeremiah unto Zedekiah, Thus saith the Lord, the God of hosts, the God of Israel, If thou wilt assuredly go forth unto the king of Babylon's princes, then thy soul shall live, and this city shall not be burned with fire, and thou shalt live in thine house. But if thou wilt not go forth to the king of Babylon's princes, then shall this city be given into the hand of the Chaldeans, and they shall burn it with fire, and thou shalt not escape out of their hand. And Zedekiah the king said unto Jeremiah, I am afraid of the Jews that are fallen to the Chaldeans, lest they deliver me into their hand, and they also mock me. Here we find that he was afraid of other Jewish prisoners that the Babylonians may have, or others who have defected and are standing out there with the Babylonians, that they've always hated me. And if I am brought in as a captive before the Babylonian king, then they're going to laugh at me, and they're going to mock me. They're going to make fun of me because I am a defeated king. And he was so stuck on himself that bothered him more than actually, seeing the city be burned up. And so we find that Zedekiah is a man of no backbone at all. Here is an individual who has decided that, he is afraid of what people will do to him. And we find continuing going down to let's continue reading here. And Zedekiah said in verse 20, But Jeremiah said, They shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech thee, the voice of the Lord which I speak unto thee, so it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. But if thou refuse to go forth, this is the word of the Lord that he has showed me. And behold, all the women that are left in the king's house, he goes on to talk about all the bad things that are going to happen to him and to his children. It's really going to be a pretty nasty mess. And going down to verse 24, Then said Zedekiah unto Jeremiah, Let no man know of these words, and thou shalt not die. In other words, once again, we see that this man's just living in fear. Now, don't let anyone know that we've talked. Don't let anyone know that we have this conversation, because that will go bad for me, it will go bad for you. He says, But if the princes hear that I've talked with you, and they come unto thee and say unto thee, Declare unto us what thou hast said unto the king, hide it not from us, and we will not put thee to death. Also what the king said unto thee. In other words, that if they come and interrogate you, if they find out we've had a conversation, here's how I want you to spin this thing. And so thou shalt say unto them, I presented my supplication before the king, that he would not cause me to return to Jonathan's house to die there. Well, that was a piece of kind of what Jeremiah had said, that he wanted to be relocated in a different prison. But don't tell them all of these details. And so here again, what we're seeing is that Zedekiah just fears the princes and what they would do to him if they knew Jeremiah's words, and he hasn't got the strength and the courage to stand up to him and to declare that I am the king and I have the right to talk to whoever I want to talk to. And so he is just a man completely consumed with fears and totally under the control of others. And so we find that Jeremiah is kept in the court of the prison. We find that they did find out about that conversation. Then came all the princes unto Jeremiah and asked him, and he told them according to all these words that the king had commanded. And so they left off speaking with him, for the matter was not perceived. They didn't think of anything else. So Jeremiah abode in the court of the prison until the day that Jerusalem was taken, and he was there when Jerusalem was taken. So he gets to go to back to the prison, and it winds up being a bit of a fortress for him, because he is saved whenever the Babylonians actually break through and take the city. Now, in question, see, that was in question 8, it says, when the city of Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, what actually happened to Zedekiah? Just for the sake of time, we won't read those first 7 verses, but paraphrasing a little bit, he fled, he slipped out a back gate, and tried to flee away from Jerusalem, but they caught him in the plains of Jericho and brought him back. And they made him watch while some of the things that Jeremiah said was going to happen did happen. They killed all of his sons before his eyes, and those were some of the last things that he saw, because they put out his eyes after that, and then they took him bound to Babylon. And that is the end of King Zedekiah. And he dies while he is in captivity in Babylon. And now in question 9, it says, what happened to the people, the city, and the temple whenever the Babylonians overran the place? Well, we go back and look up in verse 6 of the 39th chapter. It talks about then the king of Babylon slew the sons of Zedekiah in Riblah before his eyes. Also the king of Babylon slew all of the nobles of Judah. All of those princes who were so bossy and so dominating and knew better than everybody else how to run things, all of them were killed by the Babylonians. In verse 8, we find that they burned the city and broke down the walls of it. Later on, we'll read about we read in the book of Nehemiah, his coming back to rebuild those walls. The temple is burned and destroyed. All of the able-bodied folks that were not killed in the conflict were gathered together in verse 9 and taken captive. And then the poor, those that had nothing, those who were the obvious beggars, the Babylonians left them and said, look, here are the vineyards and here are the fields. You can have all this. And so all of the folks who had been the least amongst these Jewish leaders, they are rewarded and given clemency and some leniency and some favor by the Babylonians, because the Babylonians realized that they had been victims of this circumstance.
They probably figured they weren't a threat.
Yeah, that they were no threat, and who wants to let the places grow up?
More prisoners to take care of.
That's right. So really it was better off to leave this little group behind. And so then it asks, what was in question 11, let's see if I get caught up here. Question 10, going back, I skipped one. What did the king of Babylon do with Jeremiah? Well, he saved him. He realized that here was a man in prison. Obviously, he was, and there may have been others to vouch for the fact that Jeremiah was trying to get everybody to surrender, and they wouldn't listen. And so it says, they sent, in verse 14 of the 39th chapter, then they sent and took Jeremiah out of the court of the prison, and committed him unto Gedaliah, the son of Hikam, the son of Shaphan, that he should carry him home. So he dwelt among the people. Now he winds up, we'll soon see, becoming a counselor to Gedaliah. But Gedaliah is named as the new governor, and he's going to run the show here and take care of the people, the residual group that is left. And then the last verses of the 39th chapter, in question 11, what was the message to Ebed-Melech? Well, it was the promise that had been spoken even by Jeremiah, you're going to be saved. Because you were willing to run risks, you trusted God to protect you, and that is exactly what's going to happen. And so in contrast, Ebed-Melech was saved because he trusted in God and acted on that and saved Jeremiah. But Zedekiah feared men more than he feared God, and he refused Jeremiah's counsel, and as a result, he perished because of his lack of obedience. So, we find that now we get to the point of where Jerusalem has been sacked and burned. Things are in a mess, but it was the fulfillment of what God had said, and Israel is going to be carried away into captivity. Now, there's more to the story as to what happens even after this. You know, Jeremiah has been through a whole lot, and we'd like to think, well, finally, Zedekiah is gone, the kings, the princes are gone, things are going to start getting better. Well, not so much. And we'll look next time in lesson 21 at what happens as Gedaliah becomes the governor and how things work out for him. So hope you'll join us next week. Appreciate everybody participating and listening in the class tonight, those online as well. Hope we were able to pick up a few things as to what happened with Fall of Jerusalem. Joe? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there is a connection. We'll get to that as we look at Gedaliah. We will see the connection as to how all of that pans out like it does. It's pretty interesting to see how God continues to manage things. All right.